Okay, two sets of recommendations. The first really are towards the negotiations because it's not too late. We still have 6 months to change the game. And the second is about learning from what actually works at the national level, because even though, I opined earlier that, the glass is half empty, the glass is also half full. We've got a lot of good stuff which is taking place around the world. But let me start with what can be done in terms of the negotiations. So, we have Connie Hedegaard. Connie Hedegaard is a Danish Minister for Energy and Climate Change, and she is the host of COP15. She is also very pro having more and more women represented. So I suggest two things that we can take back. The first is to make sure that every single country which is required to produce a national action plan on mitigation, make sure that that is gender mainstreamed. And all of the capacity, the technical capacity is there. UNDP has it in spades, and for those countries which feel that they need to bring in, consultants, they must do that. There's enough time for it. The second is that we need to make sure that the negotiating teams which are now being trained to go to Bonn, to Bangkok, to Copenhagen are gender balanced. These are demands that must be made, because if there is no gender champion, if there is no champion to make sure that there is parity for women and men, it ain't going to happen. And that's why instead of having these discussions here, we need to have them in the boardrooms. We need to have them in the households. We need to make sure that every time the cabinet meets, and these must be cabinet level discussions, because the problem is that historically climate change negotiations have been led by environment ministries. They have not been subjected to cabinet level discussions. We need to have the finance ministries, the treasuries, all of the muscular ministries in government seeing this as the biggest economic and competitiveness issue of the day. And they need to recognize that women are at the core of their economies. And that's why making sure that there is gender mainstreaming and gender balance in the analysis as well as in the representation in Copenhagen are the two most important things that I think we can carry away with. Learning from what's happening at the national level. I can tell you scores of interesting things that are happening in India. Professor Swaminathan mentioned one of the interesting innovations that's occurred in India. We have the largest number of elected women officials in the world, because of the amendments to our constitution, which has created the panchayats, the village councils, half of whom are run by women. Actually, he's very modest, but his foundation has started a program called the Climate Managers Program, where they pick in every single one of India's 350 villages a man and a woman to train as local climate managers. That's something that I think that we can think about, certainly, deepening, but also looking at the implementation in other parts of the world. Other things are just look at women as energy users. There is we've got 30 years of experience with women as users of key resources that are currently under threat. Water, energy, and energy, let me just mention two small examples, because these are what fill me with hope. One of my best friends is one of India's best-known solar entrepreneurs, Harish Hande. And what he's doing is actually providing women. So far, our energy planning at the national level has focused on urban and industrial energy needs, not at the energy needs of as the government always says, we've got 400 million people or 600 million people, depending who you believe, who lack access to basic electricity. Well, actually, the majority of those are women, and they don't need transportation energy. They need energy for cooking, for heating, for lighting, and all of these can be provided by solar, and Harish is providing them with solar. And just to, there is a girl who is now just about to be married. She's 18 years old, and she's one of Harish's earliest clients. She was born with no carbon, fossil fuel generated electricity. She was born in a house which had a solar lamp. And for her, what's the norm? The norm is solar energy. She's getting married, and the house that she's being married into has no electricity. And they're actually looking to have a cable put in. And she's now fighting a battle saying, hey, this is 19th century technology. I'm a 21st century girl, and I want solar in my household.
Yes, thank you. I'm Robert Glasser with CARE International, and I wanted to make a couple of observations and then ask a question of the panel. The first observation was the comment about population growth, the 2 to 3 billion additional people on the planet. And it's important to point out it's not just 2 to 3 billion additional people, but it's predominantly, almost entirely in developing countries. That's where the increase is going to be, countries that are already enormously stressed and strained. Second observation, women in emergencies and humanitarian crises. In Aceh, after the tsunami, I visited villages that had no women left in the villages, left alive. Because, as you commented, and it was really one of the most harrowing things I've seen, women had run to look after their children, to grab their children in the midst of that emergency. So entire villages with no women. The question I wanted to ask concerns the distinction between climate change and women, because we're talking about the connections between the two. But quite a bit of the discussion so far has really sounded like a very traditional discussion about why sort of women and poverty, gender and poverty. So one of the questions is, what is the distinction? And what worries me is, you know, when we talk about women, at least in the aid community, Barbara's organization and my organization, we very much have begun focusing on rights-based approaches and the fact that this is about denial. Poverty is about denial of rights, and for women especially that's the case. And we know that it takes ages of hard work, a lot of effort to break down these barriers, to work in countries where the culture actually gets in the way of the rights that people need to escape from poverty. But with climate change, we don't have the time to do that. And the frustration you expressed about the delegations coming and the lack of democratizing the discussion about climate change is a really frustrating issue. And it's similar to the frustration about feminism and gender. It's bloody obvious what we need to do, but we're not doing it. In climate change, it's bloody obvious what we want to do, but we're not doing it. So the question is, we don't have the time with respect to climate change. We don't have the time with respect to working on these issues of gender either. But the clock really is ticking. So what's the solution to that problem? And is that the distinction between poverty more generally, women, and climate change?
Barbara. Oh, that's a difficult one. Well, clearly, I mean, as Robert said, I mean, a lot of this is the same because actually what we're talking about is poverty with climate change added on makes everything much worse. And that since women are at the heart of poverty, as the Princess has said, then, you know, it's worse for women, worse in disasters and so on. Yet the difference is the timing, you're right. It feels like this is a truly urgent problem. And, you know, Melina's point about, you know, don't let's give up. We have got 6 months to go. And actually, a lot of people moving concertedly to say that this has to be different can make a big difference. I don't think it'll anywhere near get us there where we'd really like to be, but we can do a lot, and we've been hearing examples of what needs to be done. I want to put a slightly more contentious point of view on the table, which is actually if we had more women in the delegations and more of a genderised approach, actually the negotiations themselves might go better. Actually, a man said this to me the other day. He said, he was very central to climate change, and he said, what's wrong with the negotiations is you've got the wrong people. What you really need in the negotiation is a lot of busy mothers. Because busy mothers are really rather good at bringing up their children day to day, seeing gradual progress, not asking for the absolute, negotiating, compromising and getting things there. And those are the sort of people we need in the negotiations, not these hard, you know, numbers-headed men. So maybe if we could get more women in the negotiations for women, we might also be the agents that are needed to actually bring about the right solution in the negotiations.
Barbara, are men so insensitive to women's needs? Do they not hear, see, or listen what's happening around them? Do they need to be told, or do they need to be moved aside and women to take their places in negotiation tables?
I think yes. You know, because I mean, when it comes to negotiations, you realize that men seems to begin to think that women are pushing into their territory, you know, and they must really exert, you know, the authority. So you find out that negotiations where, you know, gender issues, you know, come on the forefront, you know, men, I mean, somehow, you know, resist.